The sound of the gates closing behind him was the loudest thing he had ever heard. It wasn't just a noise. It was a physical feeling, a deep metallic shudder that went right through his ribs and settled in his stomach. For a long second, he just stood there, the weight of the sound pressing down on him. He was a man who was used to quiet spaces. The soft hum of a computer server, the gentle rustle of pages in a textbook, the whisper of a marker on a whiteboard. This place was all echoes, shouts, and the heavy clang of doors. He adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit, and the wire frame felt flimsy in this new, hard-edged world. T42. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who spent his life indoors, thinking, not doing. His hands were smooth. His shoulders had a slight curl from years at a desk, and his new prison uniform hung off him in a way that screamed, new fish. The guard who processed him, a big man with a tired face, looked him up and down with a mix of boredom and pity. First time? The guard grunted, not really waiting for an answer. He stamped some papers. Keep your head down, do your work, don't make friends. Library's over in C block if you like books. He just nodded, his voice stuck somewhere in his throat. His name was Leo, but that name felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone from a previous life. That life had a comfortable apartment, a daughter who loved science projects, and a job where the biggest danger was a spilled cup of coffee on a keyboard. That was all gone. In its place was 18 months. 540 days. The number echoed in his mind. A prison of its own. He was led through a series of gates and corridors. The air smelled of bleach, old sweat, and something else. Something like fear and boiled cabbage. His eyes, behind his glasses, didn't stare at the floor like some of the other new men. They moved, slowly and carefully, taking everything in. He noted the cameras in the corners, the patterns of the guards' walks, the way certain men seemed to own the space around them. He wasn't planning anything. It was just his way to observe, to understand the system he was in. His bunk was in a large, noisy room filled with rows of beds. It was as impersonal as a bus station. He placed his small bundle of allowed belongings on the thin mattress. The only personal thing was a small, worn photograph he kept in the pages of a book. It showed him and his little girl, her grin huge and missing 2 front teeth, holding a wobbling volcano science project. Looking at it made his heart ache in a way that was almost a good pain. It was the reason he was here, and the reason he had to get through this. He had made a stupid mistake, trusting the wrong person at work, and he had taken the fall to protect people he cared about. He didn't feel like a hero about it. He just felt stupid and terribly, terribly sorry. The first trip to the cafeteria was a lesson in chaos. The noise hit him first. A wall of shouting, laughing, and the clatter of plastic trays. Everyone seemed to know exactly where to go, who to sit with, what invisible lines not to cross. He felt like a ghost, moving through a world that had very solid rules he didn't understand. He got his food, a lump of something vaguely meat-like and some cold vegetables, and looked for a place to sit. He saw an empty spot at the end of a long table. It looked safe, isolated. He slipped into it, grateful to be off his feet. He pulled out his book, the same one he read every night, trying to escape into a story about a man trapped in a fortress. He was so focused on the words, trying to block out the roar around him, that he didn't notice the shadow falling over the page. When he looked up, the light was blocked by a massive man. The man had a thick neck, arms covered in tattoos of snarling animals, and a face that looked like it had been used to stop a few doors. 2 other men stood just behind him, smirking. "You're in my spot," the big man said. His voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than a shout. Leo blinked.
I'm sorry.
It was empty. He started to gather his things to move. "I said it's my spot," the man repeated. A heavy hand landed on Leo's shoulder, pinning him to the bench. "You already dirted it. Now you gotta pay the cleaning fee." Leo froze. He understood what was happening. This was the test, the ritual he had feared. "I don't have anything," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The big man, whose name was Carver, just smiled. One of the other men, a wiry guy with quick hands, reached over and took the dessert cup from Leo's tray. A small cup of bright red jelly. The other man picked up Leo's book. Hey, Leo said, a little stronger now. The book was his escape. The man with the book, Reyes, grinned and tossed it underhand. It sailed through the air and landed with a soft plop right in the middle of a puddle of spilled coffee and something worse on the floor. Leo watched as the dark liquid seeped into the pages, ruining them. He didn't move. He didn't say another word. He just watched his escape sink into the muck. Carver finally took his hand off Leo's shoulder. Remember your place, spreadsheet. It saves trouble. They walked away, laughing. Leo sat there for another minute, then slowly got up. He left his tray. He walked over and picked up the sodden book, holding it by a dry corner. He walked back to his bunk, the wet book dripping a trail behind him, feeling every single pair of eyes in the room on his back. The first day was over. He had learned the first rule. He belonged to them now. The only question was what the price would be. The days began to blend into one long, gray stretch of time. The bullying didn't stop after the first day in the cafeteria. It just became part of the routine, like the awful food or the count times. Leo quickly learned that he had been assigned a role in this little world, and his role was to be the punching bag. It was never anything big enough to get the guards seriously involved. It was the small, constant stuff designed to wear him down. In the yard, as he walked the track trying to keep to himself, one of Carver's friends, a big guy with a shaved head named Dobbs, would accidentally bump into him, sending him stumbling off the path into the dirt. The first few times, Leo would just get up, brush himself off, and keep walking, saying nothing. The men watching would chuckle. I in the shower line. Someone would always shove him from behind, making him drop his soap or his towel. The floor was always cold and wet. He'd have to pick it up under the spray of the water while the others laughed. They started calling him Mouse. The name stuck. Soon, even men who weren't part of Carver's group would nod at him and say, "Watch your step, Mouse." It was his new name. He hated it, but he answered to it. The worst part was the theft. He had very little from the commissary. Some crackers, a few packets of soup, a chocolate bar he was saving. It was a small piece of comfort, a tiny bit of control over his life. But he could never keep it. He'd come back from his work detail, cleaning floors in the administration wing, and find his locker popped open. Not broken, just popped open with a skill that spoke of practice. His snacks would be gone. Once, they took his new bar of soap and left the slimy, used remains of theirs in its place. He never complained. He never went to the guards. He knew that would only make it worse. He absorbed it all with a quiet, still face. Inside, he was screaming. Inside, he was thinking of his daughter, her small hands, her laugh. He would use her face like a shield, trying to let the insults and the petty cruelty bounce off of it. He thought if he was quiet enough, small enough, they would eventually get bored and find a new toy. But his quietness seemed to make Carver angrier. The big man wanted a reaction. Fear, tears, begging. Leo's calm silence was a type of defiance he didn't understand. One afternoon, in their cell block, Carver cornered him by the sinks. "You think you're better than us, Mouse?" Carver asked, his voice low. "With your glasses and your silent treatment? You think you're smart?" Leo just looked at him, then looked down at the floor. A classic Mouse move. "No," he mumbled. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Carver barked. Leo looked up. Behind his glasses, his eyes were unreadable. They weren't full of fear. They were just tired. And that, for some reason, was the most insulting thing of all to Carver. "You're nothing here," Carver hissed. "You're less than nothing. You're a stain. And I'm going to make sure you never forget it." The only time Leo felt like a human being was during his weekly video call. It was in a small, crowded room with other men talking to their families on old computer monitors. The noise was terrible, but when his daughter's face flickered onto the screen, everything else faded. "Hey, sweetheart," he'd say, and he could feel his face doing a strange thing. It would smile, a real, true smile that hurt his cheeks. "Dad, did you get my letter with the drawing of the rocket?" "I did. It's taped right by my bed. It's the best rocket I've ever seen." He told her he was at a strict boarding school, that he was working on a big, important project, that required him to stay there. He said the food was bad and the other students were a bit rough, but the teachers were okay. He asked about school, about her friends, about the cat. He listened to every detail, storing them away like treasures. He could see the worry sometimes in her eyes, a child's intuition that something wasn't right. So he worked harder, making his voice brighter, his stories sillier. When the call ended, and her face vanished, the emptiness that rushed in was colder than any prison shower. He'd walk back to his block, the echo of her "I love you," Dad bouncing around in his hollowed-out chest. It was the fuel that kept him going. And it was also the thing that made the next shove in the line, the next stolen packet of crackers, feel 1,000 times worse. He started spending more time in the prison library. It was a sad little room with dusty books, but it was quiet. No one bothered him there. Carver and his friends didn't read. In here, he wasn't Mouse. He was just a man in a chair, turning pages. He read books on history, on mechanics, anything to keep his mind from rotting in the same way his spirit felt like it was. He would lose himself in other worlds, other times, and for a little while he could pretend. But he always had to go back. Back to the noise, the smells, the constant, watchful eyes of predators. He was living in a cage within a cage, making himself smaller and smaller, hoping they wouldn't see him. But he was wrong. By not fighting back, he wasn't making himself invisible. He was making himself an easy, permanent target. The pressure was building, like a kettle on a stove, and the whistle was about to blow. It would only take one thing, one precious thing, to make the quiet man stop being quiet. The pressure was a constant, heavy thing, like wearing a wet blanket all day, every day. Leo found himself moving through the routines in a kind of fog. Work detail, cafeteria, yard, cell block. The shoves and the stolen items and the name Mouse were just part of the weather in this terrible place. He kept his head down, his eyes on the cracks in the floor, counting his steps, counting the days. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the world shifted. He had just come back from his work detail, mopping the long, shiny halls of the admin building. It was a good detail. It was quiet, it was alone, and for a few hours he could just be a man with a mop, not a target. He felt almost peaceful as he walked back into the cell block, the smell of bleach still on his hands. His peace shattered the moment he saw the door to his locker. It was slightly ajar. His heart, which had been calm, gave a hard, painful thump. Not again. He walked over, already knowing what he would find. He pulled the metal door open. It was worse than usual. His new bar of soap was gone. His last 2 packets of crackers were gone. But that wasn't the worst of it. They had taken his Bible. It was a cheap, soft-covered thing, given to him by the prison chaplain. He wasn't a religious man, not really, but he read it sometimes for the stories, for the sense of order in the words. That wasn't why it was important, though. He stood very still, his fingers trembling just a little as he reached inside. He pushed past the few remaining items. A spare pair of socks, a notebook. He felt around the thin space between the locker's back wall and its metal lining. His breath caught. It was still there. They hadn't found it. He let out a shaky sigh and carefully pulled it out. It was a photograph. Small, worn at the edges from being held so much. It was a picture of him and his daughter from 2 summers ago. They were at her school science fair. She was holding a cardboard volcano that was painted a brilliant, sloppy red. It had 1 second prize. In the photo, she was grinning a huge, toothy grin. She was missing both of her front teeth at the time, and her eyes were squinted shut with pure joy. He had his arm around her shoulders, looking down at her with an expression of such open, proud love that it almost hurt to see now. This photo was his anchor. It was the reason. It was the tiny, glowing piece of his real life that he kept hidden from this place. It was the one thing they could not have. He would look at it every night before he tried to sleep, tracing the lines of her smile with his thumb, remembering the feel of her small hand in his. He held it now, safe in his palm, and for a moment, the cell block faded away. He was back in that noisy gymnasium, surrounded by baking soda volcanoes and solar system models. He could almost smell the glue and poster paint. The moment didn't last. A shadow fell over him, blocking the dull light from the ceiling fixture. He knew who it was before he even looked up. He quickly, instinctively, tried to slip the photo into his pants pocket. "Find anything good, Mouse?" It was Carver. He was leaning against the locker next to Leo's, a mean little smile playing on his lips. Dobbs and Reyes were with him, forming a half-circle. There was no way out. Leo closed his fist around the photo. "No," he said, his voice flat. "It's all gone. You took it." "We took what was owed," Carver said smoothly. His eyes, however, weren't on the locker. They were fixed on Leo's closed hand. "What you got there? Hiding something special from us?" "Nothing," Leo said too quickly. He took a step back, his back pressing against the cold metal of the lockers. "Doesn't look like nothing," Reyes chimed in, taking a step forward. "Looks like a little secret. We don't like secrets here, Mouse. Everything gets shared." "It's private," Leo said. The words came out strained. He could feel the heat rising in his neck, a prickling sensation under his skin. The photo in his hand felt like it was burning him. "Private?" Carver laughed, a short, barking sound. "You ain't got private. You gave that up when you walked in here. Now hand it over. Let's see what's so important to a little mouse." Carver reached out, his big hand open, expecting Leo to just obey. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. Leo didn't move. He just looked at Carver's hand, then up at his face. Something was changing inside him, something cold and hard settling into place. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a final, clear understanding. This line could not be crossed. This one thing they could not have. "I said it's private," Leo repeated. His voice was different. It wasn't the mumble of the mouse. It was low, clear, and it didn't waver. The smirk slowly faded from Carver's face. The boredom in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of surprise, then irritation. This was defiance. Real defiance. And it was happening in front of his men. "Give here." Carver said each word slowly, with a quiet menace that usually made men fold. Leo took a breath. It was a deep, steadying breath that filled his lungs. He didn't look at Dobbs or Reyes. He kept his eyes locked on Carver. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sneer. He simply said, in that same terrifyingly calm tone, "No." The entire cell block had gone quiet. Men stopped what they were doing. They turned from their card games, they looked up from their bunks. They felt the change in the air, like the pressure dropping before a storm. Carver's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. The mouse was biting. "You think you can tell me no?" he growled, taking a step forward, his bulk looming over Leo. "I will break you in half." Leo didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He slowly, deliberately, moved the photo to his left hand and tucked it safely into his pocket, buttoning the flap. It was a gesture of pure, deliberate contempt. He was putting his treasure away because he knew what was coming next, and he was preparing for it. His right hand came up, not in a fist, but open palms facing Carver in a gesture that was almost peaceful. But his feet, unnoticed by the bullies, shifted. His right foot slid back slightly. His knees bent just a fraction. His shoulders, which were always curled forward, seemed to square up. He was no longer making himself small. The man who was once called Mouse looked at the bully who had tormented him for weeks and spoke his last quiet words. "This is your last chance," Leo said, his voice a near whisper that somehow carried across the silent room. "Walk away." For a heartbeat, no one moved. They were all frozen in the scene. The big, furious bully, his two smirking friends, and the small, quiet man who was suddenly standing like a rock in a river. Then, with a roar of pure fury, Carver swung. The roar was the last sound Carver made for a while. His fist, a big, meaty hammer of a thing, came flying towards Leo's face. It wasn't a skilled punch. It was pure, angry force, meant to smash and end things. Leo moved. It wasn't a jump or a scramble. It was a slip. His head moved just an inch or two to the right, a smooth, economical tilt of his neck. Carver's knuckles brushed past Leo's ear, missing completely. The force of the wild swing pulled Carver forward, off balance for a split second. In that second, the quiet man was gone. What stood in his place was someone else entirely. Leo's body, which had looked soft and slumped for weeks, seemed to snap into a different shape. His feet, now firmly planted, pushed off the floor. The movement started from his back foot, traveled up his leg, through his hips, and into his shoulder. His right arm, which had been hanging by his side, shot forward. It wasn't a wild haymaker. It was a jab, straight, fast, and sharp as a needle. His fist, clenched tight now, connected with a crisp smack right on the point of Carver's nose. Carver's head jerked back. A spray of red mist filled the air. He grunted, more in shock than pain, his eyes wide and confused. Leo didn't pause. He was a machine clicking into a well-oiled gear. As Carver staggered back, Leo followed. His left foot stepped forward. His whole body pivoted, putting his weight behind his other fist. This punch across was different. It had the full, focused power of his entire body behind it. It wasn't just an arm swinging. It was like a piston firing from the floor up. The sound it made when it landed was a sickening, wet crunch. It was the sound of cartilage giving way. Carver's eyes rolled back in his head. His legs, which had been wobbling, gave out completely. He fell straight back, like a tree being felled, and hit the concrete floor with a heavy, final thud. He didn't move. He was out cold, a trickle of blood already starting to run from his ruined nose into his open, unconscious mouth. Silenced. It was a thick, total silence that swallowed the entire cell block. The card game was forgotten. Men stood frozen halfway out of their bunks. Dobbs and Reyes were statues, their smirks replaced by looks of pure, open-mouthed shock. They stared from the massive, fallen Carver to the small, bespectacled man standing over him. Leo stood breathing steadily, his fists still up. His glasses were slightly askew. He slowly lowered his hands. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look angry. He looked focused, calm. He took a deep breath in through his nose and let it out through his mouth, a fighter's habit to steady the heart. He reached up with a slightly trembling hand and straightened his glasses. Then he did something that seemed even more strange to the watching men. He turned, completely ignoring the two stunned bullies, and walked back to his locker. He unbuttoned his pocket and took out the photograph. He looked at it for a second, a flicker of something soft crossing his face. Then he carefully put it back in its hiding place. Only then did he turn to face the room. The spell was broken by the sound of heavy boots running. Two guards burst into the block, their batons out. "What's going on here? Break it up." They saw Carver on the floor first. Then they saw Leo standing nearby, his knuckles red. One guard, an older man with a tired face and a gray mustache, knelt next to Carver. The other guard, younger, stepped towards Leo. "You, on the ground. Now." Leo started to comply, slowly getting to his knees. "Hold on, Davis," the older guard said. He was looking at Carver, then at the small crowd, then back at Leo. His eyes narrowed. He'd been a guard here for 20 years. He'd seen 1,000 fights. Most of them were messy, a tangle of limbs and cursing. This was different. One punch, two, and a guy Carver's size was down and out cold. The older guard stood up. He walked over to Leo, who was now kneeling on the floor, hands behind his head. The guard looked down at him, really looked at him. He studied the glasses, the quiet face, the intelligent eyes that were now watching him back without fear. A slow recognition dawned on the guard's weathered face. He snapped his fingers softly. "Right?" the old guard said, not quite a question. "Leon Wright." Leo gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The old guard whistled, long and low. He shook his head and looked over at the younger guard. "Call medical for this one," he said, pointing a thumb at Carver. Then he looked back at Leo, a strange mix of respect and pity in his eyes. "I'll be damned. I knew I'd seen you before. Took me a minute without the headgear and the gloves." The younger guard was confused. "Who? What are you talking about, Jenkins?" The old guard, Jenkins, helped Leo to his feet. He didn't cuff him. He just shook his head again, a faint smile on his lips. "This here," he said loud enough for the whole block to hear. Is Leon the librarian right? Won the Golden Gloves tournament. Not once. 3 years straight. Middleweight champion. That was what? 20 years ago. Leo brushed some dust off his pants. His voice was quiet again, back to its normal tone, but every man in the silent block heard it clearly. 22, he said. The words hung in the air. Golden Gloves. Champion. 22 years. Dobbs took a step back from Carver's still form. Reyes looked like he'd been slapped. Every man in the block was reassembling the world in their head. The nerd. The mouse. The guy who took their crap without a word. He hadn't been scared. He'd just been patient. He had been a champion boxer, a real one, walking among them the whole time. Jenkins put a hand on Leo's shoulder, not to restrain him, but to guide him. Come on, champ. You're going to the hole for a bit. Rules are rules. He started leading him towards the door as they walked out. Leo glanced back just once. Not at Carver. Not at his tormentors. He looked at the locker where his daughter's photo was hidden. Then the door closed behind him, leaving a block full of stunned men and a broken bully on the floor, surrounded by a silence that was now filled with a new, deep kind of respect. The hole, or solitary confinement, was a small, white box of a room. It had a concrete bed, a toilet, and a heavy metal door with a slot for food. It was supposed to be a punishment, a place of sensory deprivation meant to break a man's spirit. For Leo, it was the first peace and quiet he'd had in months. He sat on the edge of the hard bed, his mind replaying the last few minutes in the block, the feeling of his feet shifting into position, the smooth pivot of his hips, the solid, satisfying connection of his fist. It was a part of himself he had locked away over 20 years ago, a part he thought was gone forever. It had come back without a thought, pure muscle memory. He looked at his knuckles. They were scraped and swollen, but not badly. He'd hit perfectly, with the first 2 knuckles, just like he'd been taught as a teenager that he felt no thrill about it. No pride. Just a weary understanding. The mask was off. The game was over. He had wanted to be invisible, to just do his time and go home. Now that was impossible. Everyone knew. He closed his eyes and saw his daughter's face. He hoped, somehow, she would never have to know this version of her dad. After 3 days in the quiet dark, the door clanged open. Old Guard Jenkins was there. Time's up, champ. Let's go. The walk back to the main cell block felt different. The usual noises of the prison were the same. The shouts, the clangs, the echoes. But the eyes on him were new. They weren't the mocking, predatory stares from before. They were looks of curiosity, of assessment, and in some cases a new kind of caution. News had traveled fast. The story of the mouse who turned out to be a lion was the best entertainment the place had had in years. When he walked into his block, a strange thing happened. The conversation didn't stop, but it dipped. Men glanced at him, then quickly looked away. His locker was untouched. Carver was gone, transferred to the infirmary, and then, whispers said, to a different block altogether. His nose had been broken in 2 places. Reyes and Dobbs were sitting on a bunk together. When Leo walked past, they didn't look at him. They studied their hands as if they'd never seen them before. He went to his locker. He opened it. Everything was as he'd left it. Even the 2 packets of soup that had been stolen before were back, sitting neatly on top of his spare socks. It was a message, an apology in the only language this place understood. Life didn't go back to normal because the old normal was dead. But a new routine began to form. No one shoved him in line. No one took his things. The name Mouse was never spoken again. When men spoke to him, they called him Leo or just "Hey man." It was a quiet, simple respect, earned not because he was a bully, but because he had proven he wouldn't be bullied. A few days later, he saw something that made him pause. In the yard, a young inmate, a skinny kid who couldn't have been more than 19, was being cornered by Reyes. The kid had just gotten a package, and Reyes was clearly trying to tax him for it. A hand out, a mean smile on his face. The kid looked terrified, clutching a bag of chips to his chest. Leo watched for a moment from his usual spot on a bench. He saw himself in that kid, the fear, the helplessness. He stood up and walked over. He didn't walk fast or angrily. He just moved until he was standing beside the young inmate. Reyes looked up. His smile vanished. His eyes, for a second, flickered with the memory of Carver on the floor. "This ain't your business," Reyes said, but his voice lacked its old force. "It is today," Leo said quietly. He didn't put his hands up. He didn't make a fist. He just looked at Reyes. "He's not on the menu. Find someone else to bother." Reyes's jaw tightened. He was being challenged in front of others. But the memory was too fresh, the fear too real. He wasn't Carver. He was a follower, and his leader was gone. He looked from Leo's calm face to the kid, and then he just scoffed, a weak attempt to save face. "Whatever. Not worth it anyway." He turned and walked away, trying to swagger. The young inmate let out a shuddering breath. He looked at Leo, his eyes wide. "Take thanks, man." "Don't thank me," Leo said, his voice low. "Just be smart. Don't flash what you have. And stand up straight. Looking scared is what makes you food." He gave the kid a short nod and walked back to his bench. That he hadn't done it to be a hero. He'd done it because he was tired of seeing the same ugly play happen over and over. He'd broken one bully, but the system of bullies remained. He couldn't fix the system, but maybe he could create a small, safe corner in it. Later that week, the young inmate, whose name was Danny, approached him in the library. "Hey, Leo." Leo looked up from his book. "That thing you did with your feet. Before you know." Danny mimicked a little slip of the head. "Was that like boxing?" Leo nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's called slipping a punch." Would you show me?" Danny asked, his voice full of a desperate hope. "Not to start fights. Just so I don't look so scared all the time." Leo looked at the kid's earnest, nervous face. He saw a desire not for violence, but for confidence. For a way to stop being a victim. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he closed his book. "Okay," he said, "but not here. And not to fight. To understand. To defend. There's a difference." And so, in a dusty, unused storage room next to the prison gym, something new began. It started with just Leo and Danny. Leo showed him the basic stance, feet shoulder width, knees bent, hands up. He taught him how to breathe, how to move his head, how to see a punch coming not with panic, but with perception. "It's a chess game," Leo told him, his old coach's words coming back. "Your body is the piece. You move it out of the way." Word, of course, got out. Another man asked to join. Then another. They weren't tough guys. They were the quiet ones, the ones who got pushed around. Leo didn't turn them away. He wasn't building an army. He was teaching a skill. A skill that was, for him, about discipline and control more than power. That he found himself falling into an old rhythm. The calls of instruction, the demonstration of footwork, the focus on breath and balance. For an hour a day in that dusty room, he wasn't an inmate. He was a teacher. And the men listening weren't just prisoners. They were students, hungry to learn how to carry themselves in a world that had tried to break them. The champion was gone, locked in the past. But the man he had become had finally found a way to be useful again. The dusty storage room became an island. The air was always thick with the smell of old sweat and concrete dust. But for the handful of men who gathered there in the afternoons, it smelled like freedom. It was a freedom of the mind, more than anything. Leo stood in the middle of the cleared space. 5 men, including young Danny, stood watching him. They were all different ages, different backgrounds, but they wore the same expression. Focused, serious, and for the first time in a long time, hopeful. "Today, we're not even throwing a punch," Leo said, his voice calm. He had his glasses on, pushed up on his nose. "Today, we're learning how to stand." One of the men, a big guy named Paul who had a gentle face, shifted his weight. "We know how to stand, Leo." "No, you don't," Leo said, not unkindly. "You stand like a man waiting to be hit. I want you to stand like a man who owns the ground under his feet." He dropped into his stance. It looked easy, natural. His feet were planted, knees slightly bent, his body loose but ready. "See? You're not stiff. You're a spring. You can move any direction. You're rooted, but you're not a tree. A tree gets knocked down. He had them mimic him. He walked around, gently adjusting a shoulder here, nudging a foot there. Breathe, he reminded them constantly. Out when you move, in when you settle. Your breath is your anchor. He taught them the slip. He held up a padded mitt and slowly pushed it towards Danny's face. Don't close your eyes, Leo instructed. Watch it come. Now move your head. Just an inch. Let it go past you. Danny flinched the first few times, his eyes squeezing shut. But then he got it. The mitt slid past his cheek. A huge, surprised grin broke out on his face. I did it. That's it, Leo said. A small, real smile touching his own lips. That's the whole point. To let the trouble go past you. In here and out there. It wasn't about fighting. That was the rule. It was about presence. It was about not looking like prey. As the days turned into weeks, the men in his group began to change. They walked differently in the yard, shoulders back, heads up, eyes aware but not fearful. They didn't swagger. They carried themselves with a quiet certainty. Bullies, who are like any predator, look for the easiest target. They started looking elsewhere. The story of what happened to Carver had become legend, but the reality of what Leo was doing now was even more powerful. He wasn't creating more Carvers. He was creating men who didn't need to be Carvers, and who wouldn't be victims. One afternoon, as the group was finishing up, the door to the storage room creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright light of the hallway. It was Carver. The room went instantly still. Danny and the others tensed, their new stances automatically coming up. Carver's nose was healed, but it was crooked now, a permanent reminder of his mistake. He looked thinner, deflated. His eyes scanned the room and landed on Leo. Leo didn't move into a fighting stance. He just stood there, waiting. Carver took a few steps into the room. He wasn't looking for a fight. His hands were at his sides. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. He looked at the floor, then at Leo. Right, Carver said. His voice was rough, quieter than it used to be. Carver, Leo replied. His tone neutral, and awkward silence hung between them. The other men watched, barely breathing. Carver seemed to struggle with something. The old pride was still there, wrestling with a new understanding. I'm getting out tomorrow, he finally said. Early release. Leo just nodded. Good for you. Another pause. Carver's eyes flicked to the men standing behind Leo, to their attentive faces. He saw what Leo had built in his absence. Not a gang, but a school. The respect in the room was for the teacher, not the fighter. Yeah, Carver mumbled. He looked directly at Leo then, and gave a single stiff nod. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't an apology. But it was an acknowledgement. It was the closest thing to "you were right" that a man like Carver could ever manage. Then he turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him. The tension rushed out of the room. Paul let out a long breath. What was that about? Leo watched the closed door for a moment. Closure, he said simply. He turned back to his group. All right, let's cool down. Stretch it out. Remember, the body keeps the score. You treat it right, it'll be there for you. The lesson continued, but the mood had shifted. Carver's visit was like a chapter closing for everyone. The old threat was gone, and what Leo was building was now the solid, real thing in front of them. Later, as they were leaving, old guard Jenkins was leaning against the wall outside. He pushed off as Leo walked out. Running quite the club in there, right? It's not a club, Leo said, wiping his face with a towel. It's just exercise. Jenkins fell into step beside him as they walked down the corridor. Exercise, huh? I've been here 25 years. I've seen gangs form. I've seen fight clubs start. This, he gestured back towards the storage room. This is different. You're making them calmer. Fewer incidents in the yard from your boys. He gave Leo a sidelong glance. The wardens noticed. He's letting it slide because it keeps the peace. Don't make me regret it. I won't, Leo said, and he meant it. Jenkins stopped walking. You know, my nephew was a boxer, amateur. Told me once that the best fighters he knew were the quiet ones. They didn't have anything to prove in the street. They'd already proved it to themselves in the ring. He looked at Leo. You proved it to everyone else in here. Now you're proving something else. Just thought you should know someone sees it. He clapped Leo on the shoulder and walked away, his keys jangling. Leo stood in the corridor for a minute, thinking. He hadn't set out to prove anything. He had just been trying to survive, then to protect a photograph, then to help a scared kid. But the old guard was right. Without meaning to, he had built something. A small space where dignity could be practiced like a jab or a slip. It was a fragile thing, but in a place where everything was hard, fragile things were the most valuable of all. He walked back to his block, not as a champion, not as a victim, but as a man who had finally found his footing. The last morning felt different from the very first second he opened his eyes. It wasn't the stale air of the cell block or the familiar groan of the pipes that had changed. It was him, the heavy, coiled tension that had been his constant companion for 18 months was just gone. It had been leaking away slowly over the past few weeks, ever since the lessons in the storage room began. Today, there was only a light, almost fragile feeling in his chest. It felt like hope, and he was almost afraid to breathe too hard in case. He scared it away, and he went through his final routine with a calm he hadn't known he possessed. He folded his prison-issued sheets neatly. He gave his few remaining commissary items, some writing paper, a couple of stamps, to Danny. The young man tried to refuse, but Leo insisted. You write to your family, Leo told him. Tell them you're doing okay. That's important. Danny nodded, his eyes a little too bright. I will. Thanks, Leo, for everything. Other men from the group, and even a few he'd never officially taught, came up to him as he waited for processing. They didn't say much. A handshake, a nod, a simple, take care out there. Paul, the big gentle man, just squeezed his shoulder so hard it almost hurt. The respect was quiet, real. It wasn't for the knockout punch. It was for the patience that came after. It was for the afternoons in the dusty room, teaching them how to stand tall. Old Guard Jenkins was the one who processed him out. As he handed Leo a bag with his old civilian clothes, the khaki pants and button-down shirt that felt like a costume from another life, Jenkins smiled. Gonna be strange not seeing you around, champ. Strange for me too, Leo admitted, pulling on the shirt. The fabric felt foreign against his skin. You leave an impression, you know, Jenkins said, leaning on the counter. That little group of yours is still going. Danny and Paul are running it. Called it the Footwork Club. He chuckled. You did a good thing. Leo just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't thought about a legacy. He was just trying to get through the day. But the idea that something halfway decent might continue in this place made the whole experience feel less like a waste. The final gate stood before him. The same deafening metallic shriek he'd heard 18 months ago now sounded different. This time, it was the sound of something opening, not closing. He stepped through. The outside air hit him first. It was a cool morning, and the air was fresh, carrying the distant smell of wet grass and asphalt. It was so clean it almost burned his lungs. He stood on the steps, a free man, blinking in the gray morning light. The world seemed huge, loud with the sounds of distant traffic and birds, and overwhelmingly bright. A familiar car was parked just across the lot. An old, slightly rusty sedan. And standing beside it, holding a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Dad," in wildly colorful letters, was his daughter. She was taller, so much taller. His heart squeezed in his chest. He walked across the parking lot, his steps steady but his vision blurring at the edges. She dropped the sign and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair. He didn't cry, but his whole body shook with the effort of holding it in. He could feel the sharp bones of her shoulders, the solid reality of her. She was real. This was real. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice cracking. She looked up at him, her eyes, so much like her mother's, full of tears and joy. I missed you so much, Dad. Was your project really hard? He looked back for just a second at the high, grim walls of Blackwood Correctional. He thought of the fear, the loneliness, the sound of a fist hitting flesh, and the quiet sound of men learning to breathe in a dusty room. Yeah, he said, smoothing her hair. It was really hard, but it's done now. He got into the passenger seat, the familiar smell of their old car filling his senses. As his daughter chattered excitedly about school and friends and the cat, he looked out the window. The prison shrank in the side mirror, becoming smaller and smaller until it was just a speck, and then it was gone around a bend. He wasn't the man who went in. That bookish, slightly broken man had been dismantled in there. He wasn't the champion from 22 years ago either. That young fighter was a ghost of a different life. The man in the passenger seat was something new, something built from the pieces of both. He had known fear and faced it. He had known violence and controlled it. Most importantly, he had found that even in the worst place you could choose to help instead of hurt. He had found a sliver of his humanity by helping others find theirs. The car turned onto the highway, heading towards home, towards a second chance. He reached over and squeezed his daughter's hand. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning." And as she talked, filling the car with the music of her voice and her life, Leo watched the world go by. It was ordinary and beautiful. He was just an ordinary man again, a father. But he carried himself a little differently now. His back was straight. His eyes were clear. He had remembered how to stand.